New clues are emerging from the wreckage after nearly 300 people were shot down out of the blue in a devastating attack. Families painting pictures of lives lost, including at least one American. But why was Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 flying over a war zone in the first place? ABC's chief foreign correspondent Terry Moran is in Ukraine, where it's already Saturday morning. Terry?
Good morning, Rebecca. From eastern Ukraine, this is the city of Kharkiv. This is where the bodies will be brought. This is where the families will come to collect their loved ones. 298 souls who were just flying in the skies above this war-torn country, having nothing to do with it when they were blown out of the skies, their lives robbed from them. In the fields of eastern Ukraine, the wreckage still smoldered. The dead were still uncollected. The heartrending personal items, a Disney backpack, an I Heart Amsterdam t-shirt, still lay strewn about. And the shock was still fresh for local residents who witnessed the tragedy. There was a sort of explosion, this man said, and then people started falling from the sky. They searched the sunflower fields, so beautiful, but today littered with horror. At least one American is among the dead. Quinn Lucas Shansman, a 19-year-old with dual U.S.-Dutch citizenship, shown here with his girlfriend. He was on his way to meet his family for a vacation in Malaysia. An avid soccer player, his former team reeling today. We can barely comprehend the news. President Obama called the downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 an outrage of unspeakable proportions.
Nearly 300 innocent lives were taken. Men, women, children, infants who had nothing to do with the crisis in Ukraine.
He said a clear picture is emerging of what brought down the Boeing 777 in eastern Ukraine near the border with Russia.
Evidence indicates that the plane was shot down by a surface-to-air missile that was launched from an area that is controlled by Russian-backed separatists inside of Ukraine.
The president called for an immediate ceasefire, and even as the grim reality of the devastation set in, new questions emerged. Should the plane have been flying over the volatile region? How can we prevent this type of disaster from ever happening again? And was it an act of terror or a terrible mistake?
I think it's too early for us to be able to guess what the intentions of those who might have launched the surface-to-air missile might have had.
I'm sure this was not an intentional attempt to shoot down a passenger aircraft.
The Ukrainian government released audio that they claimed came from separatists, showing that those separatists were responsible for taking down the plane. How are things going there, one person asks. The response, well, we are 100% sure that was a civilian plane. At another point, this question. They're saying it says Malaysian Airlines. What was it doing on the Ukrainian territory? The answer? Well, then it was bringing spies. Why the hell were they flying? There's a war going on. Yesterday, Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko unequivocally placed the blame on Russia. Today, President Obama had this to say, noting that the rebels have boasted about shooting down Ukrainian military planes.
A group of separatists can't shoot down military transport planes, or they claim shoot down fighter jets without sophisticated equipment and sophisticated training, and that is coming from Russia.
With a 10-mile-long debris field, investigators began the grim process of locating and identifying the bodies of the 298 passengers on board, hailing from at least 11 countries. The Netherlands suffering the greatest loss, with 189 passengers on board. We now know that awful number, 83 children on board, including Evie, Otis, and Mo Maslin, traveling home with their grandfather to start school in Australia. Their parents still on vacation in Holland. Their aunt writing on Facebook, I will miss you so very much. At least Dad is looking out for you. The tragedy, nearly too much for Samantha Power, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, who spoke of the 3 babies among the dead, identified with a single letter on the manifest.
As we stared at the passenger lists yesterday, we saw next to 3 of the passengers' names a capital I. As we now know, the letter I stands for infant.
White flags over the debris field. They marked human remains. ABC News Moscow correspondent Kirit Radia traveled to the crash site, first flying from Moscow to Dnipropetrovsk, Ukraine, and then finishing the journey by car.
And we finally reached the region of Donetsk, which is where the majority of the heavy fighting has been taking place over the last couple months. And the mood changed the moment we got here. We ran into a couple Ukrainian military checkpoints. They were very twitchy. They were checking documents thoroughly. They were going through the trunk to make sure that we didn't have any weapons there. They had tanks and automatic weapons all behind barricades.
Air traffic routes over eastern Ukraine are now closed. Kirit arrived on the scene just before dark.
This is where the bulk of the plane landed. Take a look. You've got the landing gear here. You've got a turbine from one of the engines. And all the way in the back there, you can still see some smoke coming out. This wreckage still smoldering more than 24 hours later. And the smell of burning jet fuel and death everywhere. Residents say this was one giant inferno right after the crash.
Late today, an international team of investigators arrived, but armed separatists stalked them as they worked. And the team said afterwards that they did not get proper access to the crash site. So how did this happen? At the time of the crash, the route was open at higher altitudes, including at 33,000 feet where the plane was traveling, but it was closed at lower levels.
The assumption by the airlines will be that if the airspace is open, it's safe. Who should have stopped this flight and other flights from flying on this route is the question of the day. It's not as if people didn't know that airplanes were being shot down by missiles in this area.
Before the airspace was shut down, 67 commercial airplanes had operated in that airspace.
It's quite likely that this plane could have been any airliner flying overhead, any one of 700 airplanes that are flying over this route on any given day, which is what makes it so frightening.
Relatives gathered in Amsterdam and Kuala Lumpur awaiting information about loved ones and word on when they could travel to the crash site. Among the dead, AIDS researchers and health workers headed to a conference.
This incredibly sad and sensitive time, the IAS stands with our international family and sends condolences to the loved ones of those who have been lost in this tragedy.
Australian couple Irene and George Burrows are once again mourning the loss of a loved one on a Malaysian air flight. After losing their son and daughter-in-law in the disappearance of Malaysian Flight 370 last March, the couple is now coping with the loss of their step-granddaughter and her husband, who are among the dead on Flight 17. Carlin Kaiser, a 25-year-old doctoral student in chemistry at Indiana University, was also on the plane. The Dutch citizen was a decorated member of the varsity rowing team.
You were a better person just by being next to her, just by knowing her.
Her classmate also remembered her smile.
She was always smiling. She was always positive.
The fields of eastern Ukraine are calm now. It is the calm of bewildering and senseless tragedy, the quiet of the dead, who nevertheless cry out from here for justice. For Nightline, I'm Terry Moran in Kharkiv, Ukraine.